I now invite you to start the meeting.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning. I'm David Jameson, the Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands. Welcome to the Strategic Policing and Crime Board for the West Midlands. It's 10 a.m. on Tuesday, the 21st of July, 2020. We have a very full agenda today, which is available on our website. So firstly, I'm going to ask for apologies that we've had for the meeting. I have two apologies that have been given to me. One is from board members Kath Hannon and also Tom McNeil, who also both have sort of family issues to which they have to attend. Are there any other apologies we've had for the meeting? I see no indications of that. So just before we start, a little bit later on, we'll be seeing the Deputy Chief Constable, Vanessa Jardine. I'd like to welcome her as this is the first meeting she'll attend, full meeting attend in her new capacity as Deputy Chief Constable. So I say a very warm welcome to her. Also, two appointments that have been made to the force at Assistant Chief Constable level. These were made in the last fortnight of both Danny Long and Matt Ward. And we're delighted to welcome both as truly outstanding officers who will be seen at this board meeting, I'm sure, on future occasions. If we move on now to item 2, notes of the last meeting, there was only one action point from there which has been dealt with. It was in regard to the publication of stop and search materials from panels, and I understand that has now been activated. So I think that was the only point. Are there any other matters arising from the previous notes of the meeting that anybody wants to raise? I see no indication, so let us move on then. Now, questions 3 and 4, questions from members of the public. As you recall, we had quite a few questions last time. This time we don't have any questions for the members of the public. However, some of the issues that they raised last time will be also covered in some of the items on the agenda later on. And also questions from the board. Again, those questions are going to be incorporated into the items on the agenda that we have, the very full agenda we have today. So we move rapidly on to item 5, which is in the area of hidden crimes, both items 5 and 6. And the first item is the Public Protection Unit work on hidden crimes. And for items 5 and 6, I'm going to invite my Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner, Wahid Salim, if you would chair this part of the meeting. Wahid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you. I'd like to invite Matt Shear, who's joined us today to present the item agenda number 5. So we go straight to Matt. Do you want to give us a brief overview of the paper? All board members would have read the paper, so if there's any particular issues you would like to highlight in your preamble, and then we'll go into questioning.
Thank you very much. So the paper that I'm related to, it talks about hidden crime, but specifically hate crime. I'm the hate crime lead for the force. So hate crime is a significant focus and priority for West Midlands Police under its vulnerability workstream. My assessment is that sustained and continued improvement has been achieved in our understanding and response to hate crime, but that there's always more progress to be made. In terms of our understanding of hate crime, I would highlight the improvements we've made to accessibility for victims and witnesses of hate crime. And also that we have developed our intelligence and analysis of hate crime, and we use that across our neighbourhood policing function to influence locally designed intervention and prevention approaches. This is needed because, as the paper highlights, since COVID restrictions have been relaxed, we have seen, in line with the national picture, a significant increase in reported levels. We continue to expand our hate crime network of key stakeholders and partners, ensuring that there is a cycle of learning from and sharing of innovation and good practice, and the paper covers some of that. We've introduced a dip sampling regime at a local level, seeking to assure ourselves of the quality of service that victims receive. And at a force level, we now have what I think is a good practice system in place of the CPS dip sampling some of our investigative outcomes, looking at feeding back into that investigative function. This particular piece, I think, combined with the enhanced focus we had at the start of the COVID situation, has helped shape a number of investigative principles that I believe will improve the force's investigative approach to hate crime moving forward. You know, I'm particularly passionate and committed around this area of work. I could go through an awful lot more information, but the one thing I'll just finish off by saying is, you know, we are looking at something, you know, some really good innovation. So I particularly highlight the Stand By Me program. It's a hate crime intervention program. It teaches people to safely intervene to support victims of hate crime. We will be the first force in the country to roll this out across the entire force. That's the level of innovation that I want to drive as part of West Midlands Police, and I think it sort of shows the level of commitment that we are showing to this hidden crime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Superintendent Chair, for that update. I'll invite members of any questions they may have. Yes, Gurinder first, and then Brendan.
Just thank you, Wade. Just a couple of questions on the third-party reporting centres. Firstly, have you done any assessment in terms of access or availability for access in the current climate? As you've reported, there's been a peak in hate crime. Have third-party reporting centres actually been available for access for people to report to? And also then generally, kind of on a bigger point, do you keep data or do you monitor data in terms of which third-party reporting centres are more used than others, and if so, you know, are there any patterns, are there things that we can do to help improve usage where appropriate?
Thank you. Chief Superintendent?
Yes, so I can answer both those questions. So in relation to the accessibility during the COVID period, obviously there were some, for example, we have many libraries that are third-party reporting centres, and clearly they were not accessible during this period. But many others were, particularly community type or protected characteristic focused umbrella groups. So it will be familiar to many people that at the start and indeed throughout the COVID period, one of the groups that was particularly being targeted were the Chinese community. So we had a number of engagement with members of the Chinese community, including with their community centre in Birmingham. They remained accessible for reporting, and many of them were able, even if they weren't directly open, were able to utilise some of our technology, accessible technology, to still refer in. So our hate crime app, they were able to advertise that out to people to utilise. The online reporting system, our live chat system, was accessible to them, as were the National True Vision hate crime reporting portal. So where we could engage with third-party reporting centres, we did, and those that couldn't directly open were able to still utilize all the different forms of technology available to them. In terms of data, it is mentioned in the report, we used to require our third-party reporting centres to maintain records of what was reported to them so that we could have that sort of assessment. That was helpful to us, but the reality was it was a really bureaucratic, burdensome process for them to maintain. And we have to be conscious that many of these are voluntary groups. And so we made an assessment, and this is some years back now, that it was too burdensome for them, and we don't require it of them anymore. The consequence of that is because of how hate crime comes into the force, we are unable to ascertain from which route it's derived from. So does it come in from the Hate Crime Act? Does it come in from a third-party reporting centre? We can't discern that at the present time. All I will say is the level of engagement we have with third-party reporting centres, bear in mind these are often, very good representatives of their community. The value of that, I can't measure, but I don't underestimate.
Thank you very much. Brendan, do you want to come back in very quickly?
Yes, please. So just on that latter point, I think it would be useful if we can find a way to determine the origin of hate crime reports, simply because if they are, if we got reports like this coming to us, which is saying that these things are working and they're functioning, then I think we should see the evidence to back that up. And if they are not working, or if they're working in certain cases, then it's about improvement. And if we're seeing hate crime increase, then we need to be on top of our response to that, and in terms of how we gather that information and how we deal with it. So I do wonder if there's things that can be done to actually find out that information where these reports originate.
At the present time, not, but I will certainly inquire with our Force Contact Centre as to whether, when we move forward with new technology that's coming on board, whether that will give us that facility or not.
Thank you very much, Judith and Shea. I've got Brendan Connor, board member, to come in next.
Thank you very much, Wahid. Matt, I wondered, given the longevity of the data that you've now got on hate crime, whether there is a profile of the perpetrators of hate crime which you can share with us. Does it tend to be a particular age group, a particular sex? Are they mainly males between the age of 24 and 30 or whatever? And then secondly, whether there's any evidence from work that you've done either locally or nationally that this leads to other forms of criminality, and particularly whether people are tending towards extreme right-wing groups as a result of their initial participation in a hate crime event.
Thank you. Both really good questions. So as part of the new regime of intel analysis we have around hate crime, we do have that information, and we do look at the nature of and profile of the sort of our victim profile and our perpetrator profile. I'm not certain as to whether it is in the paper. I don't think it is. I definitely do have that available and can share that post this. But typically, you are looking at an age category of sort of 20 to 30, tends to be male, and tends to be white. These are the descriptors that are in the main captured, but I can provide the precise analysis of that post this. As for the other forms of criminality, my view, and there is some data to suggest that, is that if you're going to be someone who engages in hate crime, particularly in a public forum, online is slightly different. But if you're going to engage in a public forum, these typically take place, the vast majority of hate crime takes place in our nighttime economy. COVID has been slightly different, but in normal times, it is city centre focused and nighttime economy focused. And so we do see association with other forms of criminality, in particular antisocial behaviour and public order offences and offences of violence. So we do see that association. In terms of the rise of the far right, that has definitely been a driver in the hate crime volume increasing, and certainly there are commentators locally and nationally that would look and suggest that that is an area of concern. It is one that through our contest board, our force contest board that ACC Matt Ward chairs, we have been looking at in terms of mapping hate crime areas of hotspot areas across our understanding of our counter-terrorism work. So that is a piece of work that we have been developing, and there is definitely some overlap there that we are looking to work together with our counter-terrorism colleagues around.
Thank you very much. So, Brendan,
could I just come back with one other question? For the group that are responsible for online or communication hate crime, is there any evidence there that they're more vulnerable to right-wing online agitation?
Sorry, can you just say that again?
Sorry, Matt. For the group who perhaps perpetrate hate crime either online or through communication devices, is there any evidence that they are either have been or have a tendency to become radicalized online by right-wing websites?
I haven't seen specific evidence of that. I think anyone who engages in hate crime online might well be vulnerable to all sorts of influences, of which one might well be the right wing.
Okay, great.
Answer that.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Chief Constable. Thank you. Welcome.
Sorry, I've had a kind of the age-old technical challenge this morning, but I'm here with you. I think there will be a growing body, I think, of evidence and research about the far right issue. I think what we would probably say is, there is a certain element to suggest the group process for people to enter far right groups is potentially more rapid. If we think about what we've seen, particularly with Islamic-inspired terrorism issues, there is often a fair amount of knowledge and awareness of Islamic faith that sometimes is drawn and distorted through that process. I think for far right groups, it's a much quicker issue, and I think the connectivity between those who may display hostile behaviours through hate crime and the potential risk of them being groomed and involved in far right activity, it is an area of interest. I think there'll be more research, but our general sense is the grooming process is easier if you're exhibiting that behaviour.
Thank you very much, Chief Constable. Okay, if there's no other questions.
If I just got a quick question, if there's nobody else there. Matt, I'm looking in paragraph 22 at the graph showing the hate strands over a period of time. And what does seem to be happening in recent months and over the last year, the hate crimes of a homophobic nature or those related to people's disability seem to have risen quite sharply, whereas those that relate to religious, transgender, or racial seem to have been fairly consistent. Is this to do with reporting, or do you think there are more incidents of that sort?
So certainly my analysis is that during the last 12 months, we saw a real and sustained spike in homophobic hate crime. And I've articulated in the paper why I think that may have been, particularly around some of the high profile incidents that crimes, violent crimes that were targeted towards that community, and some of the other protests that we saw related to the community. So certainly that's an area of concern for me. I feel that the two areas where we do need to make much more progress on in terms of our engagement with the community to reassure and give them confidence to report, it is both the disabled and transgender communities. That's the areas I'm really sort of relatively comfortable in terms of our general levels of reported hate crime from across all the protected strands, except for those two.
Thank you. Commissioner, do you want to come back in?
Yes, it's just that previously the hate crime, the figure that was at the very top was usually sort of racial or religious based, was it not? But now it does seem to be that disability was quite low. So I'm just wondering, why is disability now showing so heavily in the tables as a focus of hate crime when it wasn't to anything like that extent before?
So that's not quite my reading of the table. The racial element is on a different scalar, which is on the left-hand side. The other protected characteristics use the scalar on the right-hand side. Disability hate crime has remained relatively static and flat. Because it's so very few numbers, all you need is maybe just a few individual crimes to be reported, and it looks like a spike, but it's really and truly it's quite underreported.
Okay, I accept that because the numbers are low.
Yes.
They're going to be affected by very small changes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Wahid.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Gurinder, you wanted to come back in, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, please. Just on the figures again, I was just going to point out what Matt just said there. On the table, the racial figures actually could be a bit misleading if you don't notice the two scales on either side, and the racial figures are probably 6 times what it actually demonstrates figuratively there. But I wanted to pick up on table 3, which was the outcomes and the dip in outcomes. And I mean, the outcome rate on kind of an average is 14%, which is quite low in any case. And considering when you go back to the table 2, there's a definitely upwards trend, particularly in terms of racial and homophobic hate crime, but there's an underlying kind of trend, which is a static kind of trend on all the other themes. So the outcome rate isn't particularly good in any case, but then that dip in June is quite stark. And I'm just wondering what work is being done to get that back up to where it usually is, but even improve further.
Yes, so I agree with you. The outcome rate is not where we would want it to be. Although it's small comfort in as much as if we're having year-on-year increase in volume, if we're managing to maintain the outcome rate, it does show that we are doing something there that is right. But it's definitely an area of focus for me. And in fact, the paper mentions some investigative principles that on the back of our work with the CPS in terms of their dip sampling our investigative outcomes, alongside the focus we had around hate crime at the start of the COVID period, they've really helped shape some investigative principles that we've now built into our policy. And I've been working with not only my hate crime lead within the CID department, but also the new head of the department, to ensure that they are woven into their business as usual practices. So my belief is that we've started to identify what the good investigative practice looks like, and now build it into business as usual. So I am confident that moving forward we will be in a better position. The June picture, I believe, was because we had such a downturn in reported hate crime at the start of the COVID period. Effectively, reported volumes fell off a cliff edge, so that had a knock-on consequence just for June in terms of our outcome rate, and I do expect it to return to normal parameters.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Chief Superintendent Matt Shear, for presenting and answering the questions, and for board members for asking the very pertinent questions around this particular area.
Could I just make a very quick point? Can I just say a particular thank you, Matt, for what is an excellent report, and for the work you're doing. A good, clearly presented report, and thank you. Well done. Sorry, Wahid.
That's okay. Thank you, Commissioner. The West Midlands has always led the way in friendly and positive community relations. I wish to make it clear to those people who seem to think Chinese people living in the UK are responsible for COVID-19 that this view is absurd, and any hate crime and abuse will not be tolerated. Chinese people make a huge contribution to our community and our economy, and our officers will continue to do all they can to ensure the safety and welfare of all Chinese people living in our region. We are working closely with local universities who have a large number of Chinese students, and also looking closely at the support we have in place to help victims that can cope and recover after incidences. So on that note, I'll move on to the next agenda item and invite Harj from our office and Tara. Welcome to you both to present their report. So do you want to just highlight particular areas of the report, Harj?
Yes, hi, thanks, Wahid. The way that we were going to sort of present this paper was I was going to take you sort of through a little bit of background and put the symposium that we had last month into a bit of context, and then Tara will talk about the actual day and the findings from the symposium. So in terms of hate crime, it remains a priority within the police and crime plan, and victim services have been working to really try to understand what the needs of hate crime victims are. So, to that end, we did sort of commission a piece of research in 2017, looking at sort of mapping what support services were available for victims. And, we've also sort of worked with stakeholders and partners to understand what those needs are. What we've sort of found really is that the landscape around victim services is quite patchy. There are services for victims, but they are a little bit ad hoc. The sort of main provider in the region at the moment is Victim Support, who are delivering a pilot within 2 areas of the region, and those, there has been a lot of learning from that project. But in terms of other support, it is mainly available really through sort of identity-based organisations who work with communities on sort of particular protected characteristics, for example, LGBT Birmingham. And what's happened really, or what we found really, is that the support that is available to victims is it kind of happens by default, because the individual in question approaches that community organisation, and then they then disclose that they have been a victim of a hate crime. So what we wanted to do really was to understand what the needs of victims are, who's involved, in this kind of in this space, and initially one of the things that we did earlier on in the year was ring fence £50,000 worth of funding for providers of hate crime services. Through that, we wanted to sort of bring out, providers that are working in the community to sort of see what support they're delivering. Unfortunately, that didn't prove as fruitful as we'd hoped, we only managed to take forward Remedy, who are our sort of restorative justice provider, who are now also delivering a hate crime support service. So that's what we found through that exercise was that the landscape for victim services is still quite patchy and ad hoc. What we've kind of done since then is we held the symposium and invited partners from across the region, including community safety partnerships as well, and their hate crime leads, to assess the landscape and sort of do a bit of a scoping of what actually is happening out there to support victims of hate crime. So here, I'll just pause here and hand over to Tara, and she'll take us through sort of the actual day, how it went, and also what the findings were and what our next steps will be.
Thank you very much, Haj. Tara.
Thank you, Wahid. So we held the Hate Crime Symposium online on the 10th of June. And before that, we had consulted with hate crime coordinators from all the 7 local authority areas to just have an understanding of, what their objectives are within their local authorities, what support services were available, etc. And then from that, we then invited, we wanted mostly to be a voluntary sector day, but we ended up having quite a number of, groups on the day, which was very positive, including the CPS Faith Leads, for example, a local councillor from Birmingham and West Midlands Police, and 2 universities in Birmingham. And there were a number of issues that, came up on the day, including the fact that there is still limited support available in the West Midlands for victims, and a lot of individuals that were victims of hate crime, would be supported in addition to another issue that they had as a victim of another crime. So just some of the points that were raised on the day was that there is need to establish safe communities for victims of hate crime, and there's also need to increase awareness raising, which is a point that we've also raised with the Ministry of Justice to ensure that the funding that we get year on year is accommodates that, as it was quite a blocker over the past few years, which they have allowed us to do moving on. So we will definitely shape support in that respect, because a lot of victims through the agencies that were present did mention that sometimes, as victims are a victim over and over again, they don't even identify those incidents as hate crime. It's sort of daily life for many of them, and there's also a need to just improve on a multi-agency response. So for example, within housing associations, hate crime is sort of dealt with in respect of antisocial behavior, for example, which many people feel like it needs to be more specific. And because of the complexities that come with hate crime, there is need then to really distinguish between the 5 strands and services that can, adhere to those different, impacts of hate crime, because no one generic service can really cater to victims of hate crime. From the Hate Crime Symposium, then we are going to have a working group. So the first meeting is scheduled to take place end of next week. We've got a number of individuals from that group that will be taking part. And then from there, we'll have subgroups within that will address specific hate crime issues. So for example, we didn't have much representation from LGBT communities on the day, nor did we have representation from disability groups, but we have invited them to the working group because I think, we really do need their voices around the table to have a better understanding of, how specific support needs to be. That's my summary of the symposium. Thank you, Wahid.
Thank you very much, Haj and Tara. Thank you for the work that you've done to bring together the groups on this symposium. It's a very important area, and as Chief Superintendent Shear's report demonstrated, there's an increase in hate crime in the West Midlands, and any work and support that we can do to try and remove some of that is very important. I will invite members to ask any questions they may have on this report. Okay, yes, Gurinder.
Thank you, Wahid. My question is about the commissioning work that you've done. I'm just trying to find it in the report again. And you've already had one organisation come forward, Remedy. I'm just wondering what work is being done, because there are in the academic report that's attached, there's a whole load of organisations which are listed in working in a kind of similar field in the across the region. I'm just wondering what work the office is doing to work with other organisations to develop their capacity to actually provide this support work. I think if there are organisations working in similar fields, then there could be potential for further there.
Yes, so that's something that we really want to take forward through the working group. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of there are a lot of gender. Sorry, not gender, but identity-based organisations that support communities in general, so LGBT, disability centres and things like that. And what's happening is those organisations, a lot of them are third-party reporting centres, but also when people approach them for support, they then disclose crime. They disclose that they've been a victim of a crime, and so by default, those organisations end up supporting victims of crime. So what we want to explore with them actually is, are they the right people to deliver support for victims of crime? Obviously they have all the expertise in terms of the protected characteristic, but not necessarily all the expertise in terms of supporting victims of crime. So we want to really kind of really to bring them into that conversation. And as Tara mentioned, we've invited disability organisations and LGBT who are underrepresented, and we want to have that conversation directly with them with the view to, with the view to sort of maybe coordinate some sort of community response. But like Tara mentioned, all of the 5 strands of hate crime are so different. So, race and religion issues are very different to disability and, other issues. So we need to think, is the response in terms of supporting victims of crime, should it be a generic service or should it be a specialist service? So those are the things that we really want to thrash out in the working group.
Okay, thank you. Gurinder, you want to come back in?
Yes, please. Yeah, and then just to add to that, you've also got the intersectionality where people fall into different groups often, and the complexity of that. Just one other thing I wanted to pick up on the main report on paragraph 50, finding from the symposium. The first bullet point talks about varied responses to the presence, accessibility, and understanding of third-party reporting centres. So I think you were on the call when I asked my previous question to Matt. I'm just wondering what the experience of people from the symposium was specifically regarding this. I mean, my experience is that there are some organisations who that extent of their involvement is the certificate on the wall, and there are other organisations who are really active and really deeply involved. So, my worry is that just saying that we've got a number of third-party reporting centres actually could be masking the fact that actually there isn't really engagement, or they're not really accessible, or people running them don't really understand what needs to be done.
Raj, answer that? What was it, Tara? Sorry, Tara.
Sure, yeah, I can comment back on that, Gurinder. So from the symposium, we did find that there was a lot of misunderstanding in terms of third-party reporting centres. And what victims did highlight is that once you do report through a third-party reporting centre, what is the support afterwards? So I think we need to make it clear that, third-party reporting centres, yes, they are optional, but they are the first step and they're not necessarily support. So like Haj mentioned, in terms of the report that was commissioned in 2017, a lot of those are third-party reporting centres, but it's the specialist agencies that are still lacking in the region. So there were varied responses, and a lot of individuals did mention that, they wouldn't necessarily go to a third-party reporting centre. And hate crime is usually a matter that they would deal with within, their community or through close relatives and friends, as often it's quite, repetitive.
Haj, you're on mute. You want to come back in?
Sorry, I've had so many issues, technical issues this morning, it's unbelievable. I just wanted to add to that, I think what really struck me through the symposium was that third-party reporting centres and the support to report seems to be sort of really emphasised as the only support that's available, to victims of hate crime. And we want to sort of identify what the other support needs are, not just the support to report, but also what are their emotional and practical support needs. Do they need what advocacy needs? Do they have I think there's not really been that sort of focus in terms of our discussions and the whole hate crime narrative, and that's something that we just want to really explore.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Okay, thank you for that. I'd just like to say that I was very disappointed to note the increase in hate crime incidences towards the Eastern European communities in Warsaw. I do hope now that the leader of Warsaw Council will reflect on his recent comments about the Romanian and traveller community and instead work towards improving community relations. In Warsaw, hate crime has a massive impact on individuals, both emotionally, physically, and psychologically. And it is very important that leaders and civic leaders do not exacerbate that, but instead work towards improving community relations and supporting victims of hate crime. Okay, right. So I will end that agenda item on that point and hand over back to the Commissioner.
Thank you very much indeed, Wahid, and thank you, Tara, Harjeet, and especially to you, Matt, for your both outstanding reports. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we now move on to item 7, which is the external grants to organisations. Just a brief update today from Mark Kenyon, my Chief Finance Officer. Mark, would you present the report, please?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Commissioner. Just want to focus on a few highlights from the report, if that's okay. The report sets out the significant amount of money that the Commissioner's Office manages. In 1920, the previous financial year, we managed around £18.5 million worth of grants. This is an increase on the previous year. This is mainly due to the Violence Reduction Unit initiative starting off during the financial year, which increased the value of the grants. You can see from table 1 in the report the amount of expenditure we've incurred against each grant and the actual value of the grant, and if any carry forward applies, the value to that as well. It's important to note that these grant schemes are funded through different types of funding. So if I just call out the Victims Fund, the Early Intervention Fund and Violence Reduction Unit, those schemes are actually funded through specific grants provided by central government. And that means that we have to actually comply with those specific grant guidelines and those regulations. Usually we have to submit a plan of how we're going to spend the money and on what types of expenditure. And we want monitored through the year by the Home Office or the Ministry of Justice, whoever it is, to make sure that we're actually complying with those conditions and actually spending the money in line with those conditions. And we also have to provide reporting information in terms of what we've achieved on those areas, and in some cases evaluation reports as well. So the report goes into quite a lot of detail around each funding stream, what we've actually spent the money on and what the purpose of it was. Appendix A details the area of sort of general commissioning in terms of general grants. We've provided money to organisations to deliver certain outcomes, and you can see in the appendix the actual organisation that has been supported, the value, the nature of the project, an indication of how that project is actually going, and whether there's any sort of carry forward being applied, where the money is actually being transferred into the new financial year to deliver the actual outcomes and the outputs of the project. A lot of these projects don't start straight away during the year, and that means that they're phased over a number of years, which means that they don't fit neatly into financial years in terms of expenditure. The office has quite quite a few layers of governance around these projects in terms of how they're monitored and how they're evaluated. Most of the projects are based on certain criteria to deliver certain outcomes, and only if those outcomes and those outputs have been achieved are the organisations paid for. So that's just a brief summary, and I welcome any questions or points from the board. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Well, just one quick one from me to start with. There was some refocusing of the Active Citizens Fund, was there not, onto groups, particularly small charitable groups that were working with people who were in turn working with people who are recovering from COVID-19. Can you just give us a feel for what sort of thing we may have funded there?
Yeah, sure. So what we've done in the new financial year, we've allocated half the Active Citizens Fund allocation to community initiative funding types of expenditure, and this is, as you say, Commissioner, to organisations that actually help local people get over the impacts of COVID. Some of it's crime-related reduction activity, and some of it is sort of well-being in terms of actual activity. So, for example, we've supported groups with IT provision, so people can stay in touch during the COVID crisis, to stay in touch in relation to crime reduction and prevention activities as well. There's a whole host of projects, and when we come back to the board later in the year, setting out what we spent Active Citizens funding on, we will provide more detail as well to the board around that on the specific projects.
That'd be very helpful, because it seems to me that particularly those smaller organisations that rely heavily on volunteers, we don't want those organisations to disband or to lose their impact over this period of time, which there is a risk, of course, of them losing contact with each other. So it's really good that some of those small groups who have a big impact have been helped by that sort of funding. So, but thanks for that. Are there any other points or questions to Mark about the funding anybody wants to raise? I can hear your dog wants to raise a point, Mark. But Brendan, I think you're indicating.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Mark, from where we're acting as sort of effectively the pass-through agent for funding from, say, Ministry of Justice or wherever, do we have any areas where you have a concern over clawback being applied for programs that have run to date and that might adversely affect us during the course of the current financial year?
No, I'm not, Brendan. I go over in quite a lot of detail our returns in terms of what we spent the money on and what it's achieved, and I'm confident that we haven't got any issues in terms of sort of meeting the funding requirements from government departments.
Commissioner, if I can come in, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, yes, do come in.
Sorry, Commissioner, I just wanted to come on your previous question and just to say that we've actually funded 32 organisations through the Community Initiative Fund across the West Midlands to the tune of £100,000. And we've just opened up the next round for the Community Initiative Fund as well, where there will be another £100,000 available for community organisations that are helping in the recovery process in their communities to apply for that funding. And the breadth of activity is quite significant across those 32 organisations. And I've been to visit one of them in Handsworth, providing food for homeless people, but also not just providing food, but also providing emotional support and support and direction as well around where they can get extra help and support during this period as well. So it's been a really great initiative and has a significant impact onto communities.
Thanks, Wahid. Are there any other points or questions on this part of the report? Okay. Mark, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the work that you've been doing there. It's been really most valuable, and the work we've done in supporting some of those groups really has had quite an impact. They're, as I say, relatively small grants. From the figure where he just gave them a roundabout average of about £3,000 per group, but that small amount of money for some of those small groups has a very high impact. So thank you very much indeed. Okay, we now move on to item 8, which is the Joint Audit Committee annual report. And I am delighted that we have with us Sue Davies, who is the chair of the Audit Committee. So, Sue, I would invite you to present your report. Sue.
Many thanks, Commissioner. Delighted to be with the committee today. I'm sure you will all have read through the report, so I just want to reiterate a couple of things from it. The first is to reiterate my thanks to both the Commissioner and the Chief Constable for the way in which they've responded very swiftly and innovatively to the rapid changes in the membership of the committee. We lost no fewer than 3 members of the committee, and one was absent then for a lengthy period. Given the other priorities that you both had, it would have been quite easy not to have regarded that as the first thing you had to deal with. But we did manage to replace each of the people who left very quickly. You will see on the attendance record that we will not simply quorate, but had virtually full membership for each of our meetings, which was absolutely brilliant. Just to note that since the report was completed, our new independent member, Richard Holland, has been appointed as the vice chair of the committee. You will see that actually through the course of the year, in terms of the work of internal audit, there were some limited assurance opinions. I just want to say to the panel that actually, to me, that's an indicator that we're looking in the right places. If you didn't see any limited opinions, then what it would mean is that internal audit have got their priorities wrong and weren't looking where they needed to be. We've had not simply very thorough scrutiny of those reports by the committee, but I would want to say very positive responses from the force and the Commissioner's office where that was appropriate to the findings of those committees, of those reports. And we've been assured that actually what's been found has been taken seriously, and that steps are being taken where we found weaknesses to address them, or if there are things that can't be addressed, that there's full understanding of the risks involved. So that has actually been, I think, a positive indicator of the way that internal audit is working. In terms of this year, of course, both internal and external audit have been affected, their work, by lockdown and the continuing issues around COVID-19. So we will be seeing an amended work plan for this year, because the capacity to be out there on the front line is reduced. And of course, the external audit has been delayed, hopefully external audit are now in, but normally we would have expected to have seen their report by now. But that's all that I have to say in terms of the report. It's been a pleasure chairing the committee, and I'm delighted to be doing it for a further year. In terms of our extensions, I'm very happy to answer any questions that anyone has, Commissioner.
I'm glad to hear you're delighted to be doing a further year. Can I say that your delight is only surpassed by our own delight that you are carrying on for a further year. Are there any questions or points anyone wants to make to Sue? Wahid.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Sue, thank you for that report. Really pleased to note the progress that the internal audit, the Joint Audit Committee has made over the last year, even as we're moving into a very challenging circumstances. I just wondered if you could just give us a view about how the risk register is supporting the development of the internal audit program going forward, and if the issues around COVID-19, how are those being put back into the audit program for this coming year?
Okay, thank you for that. The way that risk is managed has been an interesting evolution. I think we can claim at the Internal Audit Committee that we've had some influence on the way that the registers are prepared, certainly on the way that they're presented from the Commissioner's office and from the force, and that there's now greater cohesion. So it's much easier to see the two risk registers and make a comparison. For instance, we have not yet had the opportunity, obviously, since we've been in the middle of COVID-19, to take a particular look at how the risks were described and addressed and how effective that was. But I think it might well then prove to be something that in retrospect we'll want to look at, because clearly whatever lessons there are to be learned from the way this was dealt with, you know, it's very important not only that we're clear on them, but potentially that, you know, we're sharing them with other public bodies. So I've no doubt that we'll be wanting to take a look at that. But we did see, and we were presented clearly with the new chapter in the police plan and the risk register associated with it.
Okay. Are there any other points or questions anyone wants to make too? Yes, Chief Constable.
I just wanted to thank Sue for the work this year. I think, as always, I do think we have an opportunity at this meeting to say thank you, because we do take you completely for granted. And actually, I think this is an area that, you know, to your credit and the work of the group has significantly improved. I'm really pleased it's managed to stay intact with the changes we've seen, but actually I'm very grateful for the work that's going on in the committee, and you know, it's got the force's confidence, and we shouldn't take that for granted.
No, here. I concur entirely with that. Thank you, Chief. Are there any other points anyone wants to make to Sue? So, Sue, can I say again thank you to you for the work you're doing and for extending your term of office as well. We are very grateful to you, and for all the others on the committee as well. You do sterling work in a sort of a quiet area, but so important in making sure that we get things right. If you weren't doing your work, a lot of other things would be going wrong in the force, and that's why we're particularly grateful to you. So thank you very much indeed, Sue. You have been very kindly you've been here from the beginning of the meeting, and if you want to stay, of course you'll be most welcome, but you may have other things that you want to attend to. But thank you, Sue.
Thank you. I don't have a dog barking at me, but I do have a 4-year-old in the house, so I will leave in order to make sure that actually she doesn't invade your meeting. Thanks very much.
Oh, that'd be rather charming if she did. I think there are prizes being given out, aren't there, for
okay.
pet or child actually intervenes on a meeting, which actually does brighten them up a little bit. We did have a cat. The cat seemed to feature quite largely on these occasions, and we did have one. My cat is just fast asleep and is so dozy. I don't think it would be bothered to appear on screen. Anyway, I'll see if I can wake it up and perhaps entertain us. But thank you, so best of luck with your child caring issues as well. Okay, right. Let's move on to item 9. Which is on the emergency chapter of the police and crime plan, and also it's the report on the longer term crime patterns as the COVID emergency subsides. Shall I hand firstly to you, Chief Constable?
I think we go straight to Jane, actually. I mean, I would say Jane has been working ferociously hard. She has a very busy job as ACC Crime for West Midlands, which is not the lightest of portfolios, but she has been acting as the gold for the COVID response, which is a considerable additional demand. So I can take nothing away from the work Jane's done. I think she can explain fully the work the force has done.
Okay, Assistant Chief Constable Jane Meyer, over to you.
Thank you. I know that I've circulated quite a detailed paper that's quite lengthy. I will just summarise some key points for you, and then if there are any questions. So particularly I've been asked to cover what our organisational recovery looks like, but also the short and long-term crime patterns that we expect in relation to the pandemic. As the Chief Constable has just said, West Midlands Police continues to coordinate the response to this major incident through a strategic coordination group, which I chair. There is also a West Midlands Regional Recovery Coordination Group, which is set up through the West Midlands Combined Authority. The response phase, which the Strategic Coordination Group coordinates, is expected to stand down over the next couple of weeks. The reality is we will be living with this virus for many months to come, but we do anticipate, as local authorities become confident in managing local outbreaks and have the devolved responsibilities in terms of those management plans, that the SCG can stand down and we can move into a more of a recovery phase. West Midlands Police continue to review the government guidance and legislation as it sort of continually evolves to ensure officers and staff can support the community with compliance with the guidance. We're currently preparing for the introduction of mandatory face coverings in shops, and also how we work with local authorities in relation to the new powers that they've been provided. Other than face coverings on public transports and shops, the main area that the police do still have powers to enforce are in relation to gatherings of more than 30 people. However, we do continue to follow the 4E approach, which is to engage, educate, encourage and enforce. So if I move on to the question of demand, it's been well reported that we did initially have significant reductions in all crime types at the start of the lockdown, which is probably understandable. However, it has slowly risen back to normal levels, and we have seen significant increases in domestic abuse and, as you have heard, in relation to hate crime. The increases that we've experienced have been experienced nationally, but I do think the levels of domestic abuse are particularly high in this area, and it's something that we're looking to explore as to the reasons why that might be. But obviously that is putting particular strain on the organisation and particularly our public protection units, which we are flexing to and obviously planning for over the forthcoming months. Violence, particularly in public places involving those under 25, is also increasing, and we continue that's likely to continue over the summer with young people out of education and with the restrictions on holiday activities. In relation to online offending, that has also increased, and it's detailed in the paper. What we do anticipate is in September that there will be an increase in child abuse reporting as schools reopen. We have worked very hard with local authorities and have seen an increase in vulnerable children who have been in school. However, with significant numbers of children out of school for long periods, we do expect that to be an increase as schools reopen and reporting comes to light. During this period, we have obviously planned for and policed the opening of the nighttime economy and the hospitality industry opening up with few incidents, which is sort of been excellent to see that people have taken responsibility in returning back to those premises. And obviously what we'll have to do in terms of any future changes in demands, it will be dependent on what restrictions are in place. So our preparations for the future will have to be quite flexible and quite nuanced. We don't know what the reopening of sporting events may look like this year, what Christmas and New Year might look like, and therefore we need to plan for what we may have seen in the past, but also plan for a new normality. In terms of the longer term issues for us, obviously the consequences of any kind of economic downturn, particularly unemployment, is likely to obviously increase deprivation in the area, and therefore will undoubtedly increase demand on West Midlands Police. It's obviously difficult to say exactly when that increase will be felt and quite in what ways it will manifest itself, but we will continue to monitor it and as we move forward. I'll just move through in terms of the paper. Obviously covers how we've used our COVID powers during the period, but I would say that as we've moved further through the pandemic, the use of those powers have lessened as the lockdown has eased and members of the public have sort of started to return to normal life. If I move to the organisational sort of learning and change piece, the paper, I think, demonstrates that we have looked very innovatively about how we deliver policing services over this period, and we are looking to maintain some of those innovative approaches in terms of being able to support communities through online and technologically enabled services. One of the particular areas we have benefited from is obviously we've got an excellent IT department, and we were able to issue 1,300 laptops incredibly quickly during this period and accelerate some of our plans in relation to the further rollout of our agility offer. That has enabled us to support the organisation and to support the people of the West Midlands by staff working in agile locations, including at home. What we've also done at Pace during this time is obviously procured significant levels of PPE, procuring over 1.5 million pieces of PPE equipment, which we continue to do in support of our officers working out and about across the region. There's some summary information in relation to testing in terms of our officers. We've officers and staff, we've had 759 people tested so far, with 45 positive tests. And I think what that demonstrates is, one, our staff are being rightly cautious and making sure that if they are feeling unwell, they are tested. But also what I think it means is that our social distancing and our PPE means that people are keeping themselves safe in the main. And then finally, at the end of the paper, we just summarise where we are financially in response to COVID-19. You'll see that the current figure is approximately £5.6 million has been spent in response to this crisis. Obviously, there's a sizable chunk relating to PPE at over 2 million. We do anticipate that there will be additional funding from government, but we, at this point, don't have the exact details about how that may be reimbursed to the force. So that's a broad summary of the paper, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may arise.
Thank you very much, Assistant Chief Constable. Can I firstly say what a good report this is, how comprehensive it is, but also how well written it is. In other words, it's very readable. When you read reports on many things, sometimes when you've read them, you don't know what the outcome was. And I think what's really good about this report is you've not just done a catalogue of things that have happened. You've actually listed some of the learning that we've had as well, which is going to be so important in the present circumstances. If I could just start by asking you a little bit about an issue you raised quite early on in the report about children and the vulnerability of children. Have you become aware of any particular vulnerability of children who have been not in school over the period of the last few months? Have they shown to be more vulnerable to being involved with crime groups or being sort of lured into criminal activities?
I don't think we've seen any empirical sort of data to suggest that. I think our professional intuition and experience would suggest that that's probably likely, not at the beginning of the lockdown, but as the lockdown has eased and you've found young people with less to do and in a position where they may be more easily exploited or encouraged because they are either bored or they are out of a school location, is surely likely to be a factor. What we have seen during the period is, again, a pretty stable number of reports in relation to broader child abuse, but we do think that there will be obviously hidden crime that won't be easily reported to us during this period that we anticipate will increase. We have had some incidents over the last few weeks that we are exploring to see whether they are just an anomaly in terms of we've had an increase. We've had a few children fall from windows in Birmingham over the last few weeks, and the chances are they are all completely independent and in isolation of each other. But we are looking to see whether there is some kind of scenario around either parental fatigue or they are in less safe locations where, you know, health and safety is less of a priority, so certainly in homes or in care settings rather than in schools, etc. But again, that's something that we are closely looking at. I think it's a little bit too early to draw any specific conclusions.
That's quite alarming. Okay, thank you for that. And in terms of the question I'm asked repeatedly now is from this Friday about face coverings in shops. And I'm being continually asked, how are the police going to enforce that? Could you just give us a bit of shed a bit of light on that for us?
Well, we're waiting for some guidance from the National Police Chief Council on exactly how we're sort of expected to police face coverings in a retail setting. But I think we can take a lot of learning for how it's gone in relation to public transport. The view is it is ordinarily the retailer or the transport provider's role to, admit people and make sure that they are complying with their expectations. So in the same way as people queue outside shops and maintain social distancing, we'll be encouraging shop owners and retailers to encourage members of the community to wear face coverings when they come into the shop. Our role will only really be to intervene to support retailers should there become any sort of particular tension or issues where individuals are not wearing face coverings. The particular area of, I suppose, nuance in relation to the retail establishment is what we have to be careful is people aren't trying to hide their identity in order to commit crime. And that's the challenging balance. But I think we all know what a face covering is, and we all know what a balaclava is, as I think NatWest Bank have recently tried to tweet about. The reality is a face covering should be covering your nose and your mouth and the lower part of your face, not the entire face. But it will be a challenge for retailers and ourselves, and we'll have to work closely with them to make sure that we are enforcing where it's appropriate. But as I said, we'll still be following the 4E approach with enforcement as the last resort.
This may be more appropriate for you, Chief. But in terms of communications, I mean, the COVID-19 was unexpected, and it threw up lots of things which we didn't have practices for, and we've had to learn very rapidly. And I think generally we've done extraordinarily well in learning those things. But one of the things that's been ongoing concern to me is communications from government and getting contemporary information from government. Now, I understand on some of the communications I've had with other PCCs in other parts of the country, they're saying that chief constables are listening to the radio, watching the television to find out what they're supposed to be doing or what the new announcement is. Do you have any feel for the communications there are with government, and are there things that we've learned that we could probably pass on to government to actually, if there's a further outbreak like this, we could perhaps improve those lines of communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look across the whole period, the area I think that was particularly difficult for policing early on was the initial announcements around the lockdown that came with lots of advice of what government wanted to do, but weren't backed by legislation. I think, if I'm honest, what we tried to do, I think, as the police service, as we often do, is cajole and assist the public to do the right thing, when actually there was a period that was not far off a week, really, where we didn't have the legislative powers to do that. And I think that was the phase, if you recall, because it seems a long while ago, there was a lot of criticism in the media about drones and walkers in the Peak District and a variety of other issues where we were trying to, I think, navigate through what was an imperative to act quickly, but without actually legislative backing. And I think, generally speaking, the public look to the police to enforce the law, not guidance, although I would always say we spend a lot of our time telling people not to do things that are unwise without any legislative support. So I think that was particularly tricky, and I agree with you that, there did feel a phase where we were learning quite a lot on the news as things move quickly. I think that has matured and improved. There is a lot of work my colleague Martin Hewitt does from National Police Chiefs Council, an operation called Tali, where we engage with government to work closely. But equally, there are phases where policing is only one factor that's been taken into account. And so some things do move perhaps a little quicker than the policy chain. And we do occasionally find some things out that are a direction of travel from media sources. I think, face coverings in shops and the shift to that, you probably all recall, started to play out over the media over a few days. I think we still found ourselves monitoring that. And but obviously policing then tries to work as to how we implement these things. I think it's very difficult, as we'd all recognise, for government. I think I'm always continually focused on the economic issues as well as the health issues. and trying to get the balance right. And I think we've tried to act responsibly. But yes, you know, on occasions, I think events have moved quickly that have required us to keep an eye on Sky Telly as much as the email queue.
And do you think that the lines of communication with government in terms of getting the opinions and consulting police over issues, I mean, are there things that could be done better there? I'm thinking particularly of the lifting of the lockdown on pubs and clubs, etc., which, you know, I think we've had this conversation that a Saturday night in the summer wasn't the best time to do it, and it didn't seem to have the hand of the sensible advice from people like yourself, Chief Constable, on that. I mean, are there ways we can improve that sort of communication as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right docking point between colleagues at the Home Office and policing is in place, you know, through the National Police Chiefs Council with the input Martin Hewitt does. I think on occasion, because the various cabinet committees, and obviously there is a substantial scientific and health bias to the approach, that on occasions, you know, the way the current emergency structures operate means sometimes that advice might not directly go into the relevant cabinet issue at the right time. But I do think the link is there. I just think there are so many dimensions of this on occasions that trying to make sure all things link together. You are right, though. The decision to open licensed premises on Saturday created some apprehension on the behalf of policing, which I think was well founded. I think it also created some ambiguity. You may be aware we were very unclear when Saturday started until probably Thursday. Was it actually 1 minute past midnight on Friday, or was it actually, as transpired, 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday? That took quite a period to work through. So some of those things, I think, you know, remain areas where we think we could get to a clearer position quickly, but the right docking points there. But, you know, those matters of detail are quite important, and it's important actually that, you know, policing continues to be consulted all the way through as policy develops.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Constable. Going to open up, anybody else has comments or questions to either Jane or to the Chief? Brendan.
Could I ask a question about the recent powers that have been given to local authorities? One of them is to enable the closure of a public outdoor space. And I just wondered whether you were concerned that this might be used effectively to close down a geographical area, for instance, Handsworth or Nechells or somewhere like that, rather than simply a beach or a park. And if you do envisage it being applied to a general geographical area, including housing, roads and the like, what planning and what resource implications there are on the police service for that likely event?
Do you want to pick that up, Jane, because you've been wrestling with this issue most directly, I think, of late?
Yeah, that's fine. So we are still digesting, I think, what the local powers are, and we are embarking on a series of tests and exercises with local authorities to see exactly how that would work and what their powers are and how they would look to deploy those. I think the reality exists, however, whether they be a local power or whether they be a government power at sort of Secretary of State level, there is still a chance that a geographical area, such as has been seen in Leicester, does have a localised lockdown of some type, and therefore, from a policing perspective, we will have to see exactly how we resource that. I think the reality is, if you see what has happened in Leicester and what happened here when we had the full lockdown, this is a matter of community compliance in the main, and actually you do see very good compliance from the community. If the wider public chose not to adhere to restrictions, ultimately policing would find that very difficult to enforce. But what we would make sure we did was that we had sufficient resources to be able to support the local authority to make sure that where there was a necessary to sort of communicate to the public, explain what the powers were and what the expectations were, and we would follow the 4E approach as we had done previously. Obviously, the challenge for us is if we are trying to do that in one area, but say, for example, 7 other local authorities are still operating as normal, we may struggle because obviously the demands on policing, there's not extra resources to be able to manage the pandemic and manage normal policing demand. And therefore, we're working with local authorities to manage their expectations about what our enforcement levels would be able to be, and how we would support them to best effect. But it's very early days in relation to them, and we are trying to work through on a sort of a testing process. We're learning from the farm outbreak in Hereford, the lockdown in Leicestershire, and working that through with each of the local authorities. They've all got outbreak management plans in place, and the role of policing are within those, but the actual nuance of a case by case, it could be a location in terms of a factory, it could be a park, it could be a geographical area, and we have to prepare for each of those kinds of scenarios.
Okay, I mean, Brendan's question is a very important one, because in Leicester, my colleagues there are telling me that it has caused a lot of discontent among various groups about the lockdown, how it came about, who was consulted, counter accusations going backwards and forwards. I mean, these things have to be handled very sensitively. And I think Brendan's quite rightly raised a question. If somewhere like Sandwell was isolated, it's just not a discrete area. It's connected to just everywhere else. But fortunately, there's no question at the moment, I understand, of any of the areas of the West Midlands being locked down. But we can see that we'd have even bigger challenges probably than they've had in Leicester, where it's not been comfortable. What has actually happened there? A lot of public discontent, I am told, and a lot of anger going on. Okay, Gurinder, you want to come in?
Thank you, Commissioner. Paragraph 31 onwards regarding direction to leave and fixed penalty notices. I just wanted to pick up the disproportionality amongst those, both in terms of ethnicity but also age as well. And I'm just wondering whether you've done any work to understand further that disproportionality, whether there are specific factors, and whether this is, I expect this, the use of these orders will be fairly limited going forward. But is there any learning that we could take from this, so that if they are used wider in the future, we can do better?
So yes, I mean, I think the fact that we've been monitoring this and looking to understand it better, I think the reality is, in the main, what you'll see is there's been over 2,000, bear with me just to get my, 2,800 directions to leave, which basically means that we are encouraging the community to move on, but we've gone past that sort of early engagement and educate stage, and we're having to sort of get quite close to enforcement, and we've been recording that detail. And what you realise is that in the main, you will find the majority of the public who will comply with a direction from a police officer to do something. Where we are stepping into enforcement, we are in a position where we are engaging often with young people, often in sort of large groups, and we are having to ultimately use our enforcement powers. As you can see, we have actually had to use the enforcement powers on quite a small number of occasions, considering the size and scale of the lockdown and the length of time it was in place. We do recognise that there is some level of disproportionality in relation to both Asian, but particularly Black people, but also that our enforcement has been directed more towards the young and those who are probably out and about, as I described, because of the lack of anything in a way else to do. We're working quite hard to understand that and make sure that officers are using their powers appropriately, but I think it's likely to be in relation to which young people we are coming across in the community. When you actually break it down to individual ward levels, I think we find that the disproportionality is even less obvious, which I think gives me more reassurance. But we do keep it closely monitored.
you want to come back, Corinda? No, okay. Are there any other comments or questions that people have? Sarah?
Thank you, Commissioner. What seems to become apparent from the experience around the localised lockdown in Leicester is the association with particular work environments, particularly low paid or possibly even illegal work, modern slavery even being highlighted, all sorts of problems there. Are you seeing anything similar in the West Midlands?
Not specifically. However, I would say that in environments where employers are probably on the sort of lower end in terms of the pay that they provide to their staff, the conditions that they sort of operate in, I think we will see less compliance with the COVID secure expectations from government. And therefore, if hygiene standards, if PPE, if social distancing is not adhered to in those workplaces, you are likely to get the spread of infection. And I think that is a reality that we are starting to see play out, both in the Hereford outbreak and also potentially in Leicester. So I think in our highly populated and more deprived areas where you may find lower paid and lower skilled work, you are potentially likely to see breaches of health and safety. You are likely to see breaches in basic working conditions for workers, which is likely to be a scenario where we may get outbreaks. In addition, obviously, our communities who don't have highly paid jobs and don't have significant savings when they are unwell may feel that they need to come to work when others might be paid to stay at home in terms of self-isolating. And although there's an expectation that employers pay, as we know in some environments, that's less likely to happen. So I think all of that is likely to cause issues. I know local authorities are absolutely alive to that and are working very hard with employers, and also to get messaging out in a variety of languages to make sure people understand what they should be expecting in the workplace to support them in their roles. But it is a challenge, I think, and it is an area where I know Public Health England are working hard to try and make sure that standards are adhered to.
Sarah, did you want to come back? Okay, Wahid.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I've got just 2 points, if I may. One is on the changes that have been implemented, which is really good to see that some of the learnings that has happened and changes that have happened during the COVID period, we're looking at making that as business as usual. Just wondered how you would be looking to communicate that to the wider public because of the changes of the way we're going to be implementing some of the services. And so that they understand that this is going to become part of the norm as part of our policing response to them. That's the first. I'll come back for the second one.
Sure. So a lot of them are about giving members of the public more choice about how they'd like to interact with us, whether that be providing a statement, whether that be attending an identification parade, for example. Some of it's also about how we interact with partners. So defence solicitors, for example, being able to consult with clients remotely. And we're also supporting, as you are very close to, the courts with virtual remand hearings so that we're not having to move prisoners between the police and court estate. So in the main, I think that it's more about a choice, and we'll advertise that on our websites and also in our sort of communications with the public. Where I think we may want to sort of step further into a particular service level change, then I think that will be mapped out according to sort of our communications campaigns and strategies. But at the moment, I don't think that there's going to be a wholesale change in how we deliver service. I think it's more going to be that we are going to enable our officers to engage with the community in a different way and allow them to engage with us in a way of their choosing. Particularly, we found during this period that members of the public are more keen to deal with this online, particularly in relation to giving statements and things like that, rather than having officers or staff in their own homes. So I think it will be more of a subtle change rather than some sort of big bang service level differential. But if it does become that, then of course we would make sure that we got that information out to communities and to community groups so they understood exactly why we were changing our service.
You had a further question, Wahid.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I just wanted to make a point about the COVID expenditure. It's very disappointing that despite the assurances and promises from the Home Office and from ministers, we still haven't received a definitive letter that the funding that has been spent on COVID-related expenditure, not just by the force, but also by the force on behalf of Policing UK, isn't being reimbursed in an efficient way. This money has already been spent, so the quicker we get the money back, the quicker we can spend that money on the services and improving services in the West Midlands. So,
I probably defer to the Chief Constable in relation to the finance. I think as the National Police Chief lead for finance, I'm sure he's working very hard on that issue.
Any thoughts, Chief?
I agree. It's quite important there's a decision made as to what the approach of government is quite soon on that. So just to be clear, that West Midlands Police is one of the forces that stepped forward to underwrite national procurement. Because there is no UK entity that is policing, we have to contract off police and crime commissioners across the country, and a number have stepped forward, and some very significant amounts of expenditure. One force particularly I know has borrowed a considerable amount of money to do this. And we will have to get into a position shortly where we either begin internal cross-charging if government doesn't do this because of issues. I don't think we're in a position where we're running the risk of having our accounts qualified last year. There is a danger some forces could end up in that position, and I don't think that's a desirable one. So we are hoping that there's a decision fairly soon. Of course, it is a cross-sector decision that Treasury will need to make. But yes, yesterday I was on the phone again with national colleagues just pressing the urgency of this, which applies to us as well as other forces.
Thank you, Chief. Are there any other points or questions anyone wants to raise? I see no hands. Again, as I said at the beginning, Jane, can I thank you for your report? You did very thorough and a very accomplished piece of work, and thank you for bringing us up to date and for answering the questions in such an accomplished way as well. So thank you very much. I'd just like to say, I'm noting from the report that domestic abuse and hate crime are now running at record levels. But I think that's partly down to the campaigns that we have been working on getting people to report, but does nonetheless indicate the level of offending in those areas. And I have been saying, as you know, for some time, that this summer could see a major increase in violence, and we're already seeing us getting back to the figures we were before COVID-19. And I'm concerned that we may go beyond and surpass what are usual figures for us. And I think that's particularly a worry amongst young people. And my big concern is that the pressure is going to be placed on the police by large numbers of young people, particularly younger men, being unemployed. As the furlough scheme unravels, we'll see a lot of them will be without a job and probably with very little money in their pocket. And that may generate a number of situations for the police. So I'm hoping that in the coming months that we can work, and I am working currently with the Combined Authority and the Mayor, firstly for them to get a full understanding what the social implications are of unemployment, and not just the economic ones, but what's happening to people in their lives. Because in the end, it's the police force that picks up those issues. When things go wrong in people's lives and there's violence, etc., it is a police force that picks that up, not generally the other services. And I've got a concern as well for people's mental health, as well as their physical health. I think all those things are important, going to be challenges to us. So I am looking, and we're working very hard with government and putting pressure on to make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can to get those young people employed in gainful activity over the coming months and certainly into next year. I think this country is probably facing a bigger challenge than I can ever remember in my lifetime amongst young people on employment. And I think for some things, although we've overcome a lot of the current problems, I think some of the social problems, we've yet to see how large those are going to become. And it's upon all of us to work to make sure that we minimize the effects of those. Right, we move on to then the Chief Constable's update. I'm going to be very cheeky here because I'm going to just say, I was going to say at the beginning, but I know you had some slight technical problems getting in at the beginning of the meeting, Chief Constable. But an update from me for you is the HMI report on roads policing and road safety came out last week, and the West Midlands was shown to be truly outstanding. And I know I always step short of saying we're the best, but I couldn't see from the report there's anybody any better doing it. We are. So the people we have working on this, in the ones working in CMPG in conjunction with Staffordshire, but also working on the local roads here in the West Midlands, where we were shown to have, we knew what we were doing. We had good strategic lead. I think that comes from yourself and your senior officers. The lead you have, a superintendent who is actually leading that particular part of work, is outstanding, as have others, those who have run that part of our activity in the past, also been outstanding. I think we are using good data, we're using well. We have an intelligence-led approach to what we're doing. And I have to say, it was disappointing to see that in some parts of the country, none of those things seem to apply. I hadn't realized just how well we were doing things. I thought this was the normal way of doing things, but clearly it isn't. So well done, Chief Constable, to you and your force and the people in CMPG and the people who do the roads policing in the West Midlands. Just one other thing you may want to sort of update on is I'm very pleased to see there's 2.5% pay rise for police officers. What we want to see is to whether the government are going to fund that pay rise, and whether we're going to see in our allocation a reflection of the pay rise that the government have offered. So, Chief, I'm sorry I've taken a little bit of your thunder there.
Problems. I will pick up the roads policing issue in the update. So I think in terms of just my response, there are a number of things I think that are really positive over the last week or two, and some challenges I think that I was going to refer to today. So first of all, you're right to say the HMIC report that came out in relation to roads policing was very positive about West Midlands Police, and of course the collaboration we have with Staffordshire through CMPG, that's a long-standing and mature collaboration that we've got in the region. I think it identified the intelligence-led approach we take, and I think I would also want to pay credit to the work staff do in that area, that they are a fundamental part of a crime-fighting police force. Some of the things we'll talk about in a moment on car cruising, they're at the forefront of the response. They've been at the forefront of the response around tackling the theft of vehicle crime and some of the organisation around that. But of course, the road safety aspects are an intrinsic part of that as well. And so we were very pleased to see that kind of integrated approach to roads policing was recognised. And I think as we go forward over the next period, particularly with Uplift, it's an area that we will continue to look at as to how we strengthen the work we do, because I still would recognise particularly nuisance vehicles is an issue that public continue to raise, is a key area of frustration, and would clearly be one we'd like to do more around. But nonetheless, the force, I think, is in a good place. The other area I think was very strong, the annual crime data came out this year, and obviously there are a number of things I think to draw out from that. The first is to say areas the force has really targeted in support of the police and crime plan this year, we've been very successful around. There has been a very, very strong focus on volume crime and volume acquisitive crime this year, because they are crimes that really affect communities and neighbourhoods. Tackling burglary, tackling vehicle crime, tackling crimes like robbery are the things the public absolutely expect the police to be doing. And as we become more stretched, both in terms of resourcing and breadth of mission, we've not got quite the same resources against those areas as we had in the past. But actually, the reductions in those areas are pretty significant this year, and they've also been coupled with rises in positive outcome rates at a time where a lot of the information is on the outcome rate and the charge summons rate falling. We've been increasing that in these areas this year with a strong focus. So that's good news. I think that what we have seen in the data, of course, is that rising crime around domestic abuse. We've talked about hate crime today. A lot of the categories that involve vulnerable people or relationship-based crimes, harassment's also gone up. And I think continues to show just quite a high proportion of work now the police are doing in terms of vulnerable people. You know, we will shortly do some more work on the Forces Force Management Statement. I think when the public see the data of quite how many missing people we deal with, you know, we now deal with considerably more missing people a day than we deal with burglary. You know, the shift in police resourcing, I think, but nonetheless, delivering on those traditional crimes are important, and it's good to see that. The current focus this year has been disrupted because of COVID, but actually in terms of crime priorities, we would expect clearly because of the lockdown to see those crimes plummet within this year. We will probably, I think, start looking in consultation with yourself, Commissioner, to perhaps take a view maybe in August or September that will provide a more accurate baseline of year-on-year comparison to start measuring the force from, because clearly from the end of March through to this period, inquisitive crime has been substantially suppressed because of the lockdown. The final bit I'd say on the numbers that we published on inquisitive crime, they were only affected by 7 days of lockdown. I found over the years that people are very cynical when we say crime's gone down and very believing when we say it's gone up. And a variety of people this year have said, well, it's clearly the lockdown. The lockdown only took 7 days of that period of reporting. So we will be focusing hard to carry on that work this year and increase the level of work we're doing around reducing violence involving young people, protecting the vulnerable, particularly in areas like domestic abuse and our response to rape, and carrying on the work around organised crime that the force does well. Which on the subject is the second positive update, I think, which is the work around Operation Venetic. The board will have seen some of this work. It is an international response to a piece of work that was done by European agencies to break into the encryption of EncroChat, which is a telephone encryption service that's offered by a private provider that enables, in this case, organised crime groups to communicate securely without the traditional means of law enforcement being able to penetrate the communications. As a result of some very good work, the encryption was broken and law enforcement was able to break into those accounts. That has had I think, a transformative impact on what we've been able to do over the last few months on organised crime, both nationally and locally. And you'll have seen there's a considerable amount of debrief work going on by law enforcement, because we've actually been able to find out quite a lot about groups that we may not have full visibility on, groups we had partial visibility that we've seen quite a lot of intelligence around, and actually some of the patterns of operations being more connected than we might have initially thought. So it's been I think somebody's given it as the equivalent of almost breaking enigma for a number of criminal groups that we've been able to do. You've probably seen the force has arrested around 93 people. It seized about £8 million worth of money, considerable amount of drugs. We're now going through the process of debriefing that and looking where we move on to on our next operations. But I think it just reinforces to me, often people equate safety with seeing more police on the streets. You know, actually, quite a lot of the work that goes on to make the public safe, they'll never see that policing does, because actually we do need to be in this space using advanced covert techniques. And I suspect not only have we seized a significant amount of crime with drugs and money, I suspect we've also prevented people being killed as a result of this activity nationally as well. So it's been a really successful phase. Then in terms of challenges, just I think two things that I would want to remark on. Jane covered comprehensively the work around COVID. We are still seeing, I think, a considerable amount of unauthorised and unregulated gatherings. Particularly the car cruising phenomenon that we see in this particular force area is a concern, and there's a lot of work we're doing around that to uphold the injunction, and we will use prosecution methods where we can do. And you'll have seen, Commissioner, we've used them around public nuisance before. We're looking very hard at that with some good degree of scrutiny. I think we are also concerned around some of the street parties where loud music's being played and large gatherings. Again, I'd remind people, and parents particularly, that the reason these events are often being driven is the absence of perhaps music events, raves and nightclubs. But some of the people who will want to draw large groups of young people together do it because they want to sell them drugs. And my intention is over the next few weeks to strengthen the force's approach to a number of these events. I know members of the public may have been frustrated that the sheer scale of these events on occasions has posed a challenge for us to break them up because it requires a considerable number of officers. We are working very hard to try and improve our ability, one, to break up the ones that pose the most significant harm, and we've had a number of successes, but it remains a focus for the force to disrupt this. I suspect this phenomenon will remain for a considerable period of time with the restrictions on music venues, nightclubs and festivals, but nonetheless, it is something we've got to police carefully because of the disruption to the public and certainly the risk to young people that I think was made out very graphically by an illegal rave in Manchester. The final area I just ought to touch on is, as we have migrated through a considerable number of protests around Black Lives Matter movement, there quite rightly remains a significant level of scrutiny on the police service in the UK and internationally on its response to issues of race. The inevitability, I think, for officers at the moment is a large amount of their interactions with the public, and particularly when using force, are likely to be subject to recordings on phones or captured. We accept that, and of course we also talked at the last meeting about officers recording themselves on body cameras incidents where there may be evidential reasons, integrity reasons, but also evidential reasons why we need to capture information. I suppose the point I would just make is there is a danger of the force being drawn into running commentaries on particular individual incidents that take place that we can't, for legal reasons or privacy reasons, fully divulge everything we've dealt with. And the reason I say that is that I suspect we will see more of these incidents, and sometimes the behaviour will require independent investigation, and independent investigation takes some time. Quite recently, there was a video circulated in social media of an incident at Sandwell involving a man who looked to be disabled being subject to force. The matter took a considerable period of time, up to 8 months, to investigate, and the IOP's decision was there were actually no issues around excessive force involved when all the material had been videoed. Sadly, I think the communication of that outcome would receive nowhere near the level of publicity the initial video does. And so I just really encourage people that if they see these videos, it's important to say they may be seeing some of what's taken place. They may not understand the full circumstances around it. If there are issues of impropriety, they can be certain we will refer it and ensure it's investigated, but we won't always be able to give the entire context. And I think as we go through what may be a very tense summer, it's important we continue to do that. We are always keen to scrutinise our officers' actions, but in many occasions, because of risks and concerns, officers will act in a particular way that may not be entirely apparent to the public when watching a particular video. So I'll end there, Commissioner, just in terms of the work. Finally, you did ask me about the pay rise. We have made some assumptions within this year, but I think, as Mark would rightly say, we are at the end of another year where we don't know how much money we've got. We are dependent upon the government's announced spending review. We would expect the money for new recruits that would come to us should take into account the pay rise, and we'll be looking carefully to make sure that's the case. But we do find ourselves with no idea as to what the force's budget is next year as a result of the spending review. So clearly, pay rises and factoring in inflationary-based increases to take into account the pressures on the force budget is something that we will be working very hard on as part of the spending review.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Constable. Are there any points, questions that anyone wants to make to the Chief? No, Brendan.
Thank you, Commissioner. It was just to make the observation that I do understand the restrictions on both legal and privacy that may arise in releasing body cam footage, but it does strike me as sort of a little odd that you find video clips being publicly available, and then the police response is, well, we've investigated it through our professional standards department, and they're satisfied that nothing unacceptable has happened. But then the associated body cam images that would support that are not then released. And certainly in one or two cases, the the time lapse between the original event and the professional standards investigation is relatively short. It's a matter of a couple of days. So the immediacy of the impact on the public would be greatly lessened if the corresponding body cam images were released. And I just think the police tend to miss an opportunity in not releasing that when they're satisfied that nothing untoward has happened.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think we can all think of one high-profile case that's not in the force area where some of those issues would apply to. So the approach I've encouraged the force to take is, if there are matters of immediate impropriety or prima facie concerns, then the matter ought to be investigated and assessed. And the public should have confidence that if the force feels there are issues that arise which indicate any sense of racial discrimination, those matters are referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, who will make a decision when they investigate them. And it's very important, I think, the force doesn't seek to get ahead of a decision made by the IOPC if there are prima facie concerns either being raised by a member of the public or maybe apparent off the video. In case the challenge then on releasing body cams, it is a really double-edged sword, and on many occasions I would love to release it, but I think there are a number of problems that arise. The first, as you are well aware, on occasions that where there are no criminal matters and the body cam footage may not entirely be flattering to some of the participants, that of course we are potentially breaching their personal data, releasing that information without their consent and permission. So I think that can create challenges in releasing that information. Second issue is we do use and release body cam footage when people have been convicted of criminal offences. We've made a very strong play of trying to make sure that's available to the public, but it's always after conviction where we can appropriately use it. The challenge of using anything in a wide sense pre-conviction is, one, it does of course raise the information challenges, but of course what we can then get in the risk of is only partially making data available, and being transparent and open is great until the occasion then when you can't release the data and people ask the question, well, you've been transparent across all these matters and now won't be transparent on this significant high profile case. So it is a very tricky area. I think we've got the policy about right. Regrettably, it does leave us in a position where on many occasions we will be criticised for our actions, probably unable to justify them to the public, and we do lose a trust opportunity. And of course, by the time the matter's fully investigated, it's somewhat late. It is a really tricky and invidious position, but unfortunately, I'm not sure we can make it more readily available. And you'll see in the practice in the States, American police forces tend to be in a position to make this information available faster. The challenge then they hit is on cases where they can't make it available, then it has the negative effect on the public who are expecting to see that data. So I think it is a really tricky issue, but we'll probably stick to the position we're in at the moment.
Okay, well, time is against us now, but thank you very much indeed, Jude, for that very comprehensive update as well. Okay, we move rapidly on then to the last item, which is the work plan. Acting Chief Executive, work plan, could you just say a few words?
Will do. Thank you, Commissioner. So the work plan sets out the areas that the board will be considering from now up until the end of March. We'll be focusing obviously a lot on the progress made on the emergency chapter, but also considering some of our more business as usual areas. And there'll also be a meeting in August for the first time in a long time due to the volume and the scale of the activity that's taking place. Just one addition that members need to be aware of is that The work that we're doing jointly with the force around the disproportionality programme needs to be added into the work plan. It's not there currently because obviously we're working and you know, putting a plan together around all that work at the moment. But there will be a quarterly update to board in terms of the progress that's been made, both on the areas of work that we're doing individually, but also the work that we're doing jointly. So the work plan that comes to the board in August will have that added into it.
Thank you, Alethea. Are there any points or questions to Alethea on the work plan? Okay, that comes to the end of our meeting. Again, Chief Constable, could you pass on to all of your officers and staff thanks for the work they've done over the difficult period we've just had. I think some of the work that's been done has been truly outstanding. So I do thank you and your staff for doing that and for helping keep the public safe when a lot of officers, of course, were putting themselves at risk by doing some of the things that they were doing. And, you know, I do commend them heavily for that and for others who've worked so hard over the last few months. But I think we've got more to go and I'm sure we'll be equal to the task. So with that, just say the next meeting will be on 18th of August. I declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.